Dorian Ashford thought his mistress was a trophy he could replace. He underestimated one thing: the woman who studied his empire from the inside knew exactly where to strike. 5 years later, she didn't just take his company, she erased his legacy. And she smiled the whole time. The penthouse stretched 73 floors above Houston glass walls, framing the city like a conquest already won. Scarlett Nash stood at the conference table, 28 years old and sharp enough to cut through steel, watching 12 men in identical Navy suits pretend to consider her proposal. The acquisition strategy she'd spent 6 weeks perfecting sat before them in bound presentations, each page a roadmap to salvaging Dorian's failing tech investment. Her fingers didn't shake when she clicked to the next slide. Revenue projections climbed across the screen in clean green bars. The oldest board member. Patterson cleared his throat without looking up. Dorian sat at the head of the table, expensive watch catching the afternoon light. His jaw was carved from the same stone as his ambition eyes, tracking her presentation with the focus of a man calculating value. She'd learned to read that expression 3 years ago when he'd first approached her at a Stanford alumni mixer back when her MBA was fresh and her cynicism hadn't yet calcified into armor. Her voice carried across the room, professional and precise. Phase 3 implements the restructuring within 18 months. Conservative estimates put us at break-even by Q6. Patterson's pen tapped against his notepad. Interesting approach. The word landed like a dismissal wrapped in courtesy. Scarlett had heard it before, that particular tone men used when they wanted credit for listening without the inconvenience of actually hearing. Dorian leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. The gesture belonged to someone accustomed to verdict and execution. Let's table this for now. Circle back after the quarterly review. Translation. Your work doesn't matter enough to decide on today. She gathered her materials without comment. The leather portfolio closed with a soft click that might as well have been a door shutting on her voice. 12 men returned to their private conversations, her presence already forgotten, a ghost who'd had the audacity to speak. The meeting dissolved into handshakes and golf plans. Scarlett walked to the elevator heels, silent on imported marble, and pressed the button for the 68th floor where her office, a converted storage room with a window, waited. 2 weeks bled into 3. The quarterly review came and went. Then one morning, Dorian's assistant sent a calendar invitation: emergency board meeting. Attendance mandatory. Scarlett arrived early, coffee still hot in her hand, and took her usual seat near the back. The board filtered in with their morning routines and territorial claim to specific chairs. Dorian entered last, commanding the room's oxygen simply by existing within it. He opened with market analysis, moved through portfolio updates, then landed on the slide that made Scarlett's coffee turn to acid in her stomach. Her restructuring plan filled the screen. Every metric she'd calculated, every timeline she'd proposed, every risk mitigation strategy she'd mapped, all of it displayed under a new title: Ashford Energy Strategic Vision Initiative. Dorian's voice carried the weight of innovation. This represents a revolutionary approach to acquisition integration. We'll implement immediately. Patterson nodded with the enthusiasm he'd withheld from Scarlett's original pitch. Brilliant strategy, Dorian. This is why you're leading the pack. The board erupted into affirmation. Men who'd barely glanced at her presentation now scribbled notes like disciples receiving commandments. Approval sailed through on unanimous vote. Dorian would receive a $300 million green light to execute a plan he'd stolen from her mind while she sat 15 feet away. Her hands stayed flat on the table. No trembling, no protest. She'd learned early that anger shown was power surrendered. The meeting adjourned. Board members clustered around Dorian, congratulating him on his vision. Scarlett slipped out before anyone could remember she existed. That evening the penthouse felt different. Same view, same furniture, same temperature-controlled air, but the space had shifted into something colder. Dorian found her on the balcony. Houston sprawled below them in sodium vapor orange. His arms circled her waist from behind, chin resting on her shoulder. You're brilliant, baby. That's why I keep you close. The words should have been compliment. Instead, they settled like sediment clouding water that had seemed clear. She turned to face him, searching his expression for guilt or acknowledgement or anything resembling recognition of theft. He smiled, genuinely pleased, a man who'd conquered another day and expected celebration. "Did you mean it?" The question escaped before calculation could stop it. His brow furrowed, confusion genuine. "Mean what?" "That you value my work." "Of course." He kissed her forehead, the gesture patronizing as a pat on a child's head. "You make everything better. I don't know what I'd do without you." Without her ideas, without her strategies, without her unpaid labor disguised as partnership. But those words stayed locked behind her teeth because speaking them would accomplish nothing except revealing the crack forming in her foundation. Somewhere in the building's lower floors, Dorian's wife existed. Natalia Ashford, 34 years old and invisible, a woman who'd signed away a decade to a man who'd turned her into wallpaper. Scarlett had seen her once at a company gala, standing near a window with a book present but fundamentally absent from her own life. Back then, Scarlett had felt something like pity mixed with superiority. That wouldn't be her fate. She was different, educated, ambitious, essential to Dorian's success in ways Natalia had never been. The universe, as it turned out, had a wicked sense of humor. 3 months passed. Spring in Houston meant heat that started early and stayed late, concrete holding warmth like grudges. The Ashford Energy Annual Gala approached 500 guests and enough champagne to drown reasonable decision-making. Scarlett spent the week before finalizing seating charts and vendor contracts, work that Natalia should have overseen but had long since abandoned. The older woman had retreated so far into herself that she'd become a rumor in her own marriage. The night of the gala. Scarlett wore emerald silk that cost more than her first car. Dorian wore satisfaction like a second skin, working the room with practiced charm, his hand occasionally finding the small of her back in a gesture of ownership disguised as affection. Halfway through dinner, between the Chilean sea bass and the deconstructed tiramisu, Dorian stood. Crystal chimed against crystal as he called for attention. "I have an announcement." 500 faces turned toward him, conversation dying into expectant silence. "Many of you know my marriage has been over in everything but paperwork for some time now." Beside him, Natalia sat motionless. No surprise crossed her features. This apparently was news she'd already received in whatever private conversation had preceded this public execution. "Natalia and I are divorcing. It's amicable and we both want what's best for everyone involved." Polite murmurs rippled through the crowd. Divorce among their circle wasn't scandal, it was practically sport. Dorian's smile widened. "And I'm pleased to announce that Scarlett Nash has agreed to become my wife. We'll marry this fall." Applause erupted, champagne glasses raised in celebration of fresh starts and new beginnings. Scarlett felt Dorian's hand close around hers, pulling her to standing, presenting her to this audience like treasure he'd won. She smiled because that's what the moment demanded, smiled while camera flashes erupted and congratulations poured in, smiled while inside something small and vital began to calcify into understanding she didn't yet have words for. The bathroom on the 3rd floor was quieter, removed from the main ballroom's chaos. Scarlett leaned against the marble counter, letting the mask slip for 30 seconds of privacy. The door opened. Natalia entered, still wearing the same navy dress she'd been in at dinner, still carrying herself like someone who'd forgotten she had bones. Their eyes met in the mirror. Scarlett straightened, defensive instincts engaging. "Congratulations." Natalia's voice carried no inflection, just sound shaped into syllables. "Thank you." Natalia moved to the sink, washing hands that didn't need washing. "You think you're special." It wasn't a question. Scarlett's jaw tightened. "I think I'm different." "That's what I thought, too." Natalia dried her hands with methodical precision. 10 years ago, when I was 24 and he was 26, when he told me I was brilliant and essential and the only one who understood him. The words landed like prophecy from someone who'd already lived the ending. "I'm actually his partner. I contribute to the business." Natalia's laugh was soft, damaged. "So did I. I helped him write the business plan that got his first investors. I introduced him to my father's contacts. I worked unpaid for 3 years while he built his empire." Scarlett wanted to argue to insist her situation was fundamentally different, but the evidence stood before her, a ghost from Christmas future wearing designer clothes and empty eyes. "You think you won?" Natalia turned, looking at her directly now. "Your version 2.0, the upgrade. Younger, sharper, more useful. But he doesn't love women, Scarlett. He collects us, uses us, and when we stop being novel, we become furniture he forgets he owns. I won't let that happen." Neither did I. Natalia moved toward the door, paused with her hand on polished brass. 5 years. That's how long until you're where I am, invisible in your own life. Good luck. The door closed with a whisper of expensive hinges. Scarlett stood alone, her reflection showing a woman in a beautiful dress who was just beginning to understand the price of admission. She dismissed the warning. Had to, because accepting it meant acknowledging that the past 3 years had been built on sand, that the man she loved saw her as inventory rather than individual. The wedding happened in November. Dallas in autumn meant blue skies and temperatures that almost forgave the summer's brutality. Ashford Estate. Dorian's family compound, sprawling across 200 acres, hosted 500 guests who arrived in imported cars and left in imported hangovers. Scarlett wore custom Vera Wang ivory silk that cost more than reasonable and felt like armor. The ceremony was magazine-perfect vows exchanged beneath a pergola wound with roses that would be dead by morning, but the cracks showed for anyone watching close enough. During the reception, Scarlett gave a toast she'd written herself, 3 minutes of carefully crafted acknowledgement of their partnership. Dorian had edited it the night before, red pen slashing through any mention of her professional contributions, adding flowery language about support and devotion. She read his version, smiled, played the role. When business associates approached their table, conversations turned to markets and acquisitions. Scarlett offered an observation about renewable energy regulations. Dorian's hand covered hers, gentle and firm. "Let's not bore everyone with work talk tonight, sweetheart." The dismissal was silk-wrapped steel. She fell silent while he held court, watching him perform the brilliance she'd helped construct. The wedding night was textbook. Expensive hotel suite, rose petals scattered by staff who'd been tipped well to execute romance. Dorian poured champagne, loosened his tie, looked at her with the satisfaction of a man who'd successfully closed a merger. "You're Mrs. Ashford now." His voice carried warmth and warning in equal measure. "Less ambition, more elegance. That's what works at this level." She'd been demoted from partner to accessory between altar and bedsheets. The first year of marriage moved like glaciers, slowly, with destructive force hidden beneath surface calm. Scarlett maintained her position at Ashford Energy, though her title had subtly shifted from senior strategic consultant to executive assistant to the CEO. Same work, diminished recognition. She still generated ideas that saved millions, still identified opportunities that others missed, still possessed a mind sharp enough to cut through market chaos and find profitable paths forward. Dorian still took credit, every time, without hesitation or acknowledgement. In April, Scarlett discovered she was pregnant. The test showed positive on a Tuesday morning, 2 pink lines that represented futures she hadn't planned for, but found herself quietly hoping toward. She told Dorian that evening in his home office, the room where he conducted business that technically never stopped, even when he pretended to be present in their marriage. He looked up from his laptop, brow furrowed at the interruption. "I'm pregnant." His expression shifted through calculation visible enough to track. Not joy, not even surprise, just assessment of how this development impacted his trajectory. "Not now. The IPO is in 3 months. This could hurt investor confidence." The words arrived without softness, just statement of fact from someone solving a logistical problem. "Dorian, we're talking about a baby. We're talking about timing." He returned to his screen conversation, already over in his mind. "Handle it quietly. After the IPO, we can try again when it makes sense." Handle it, like she was dealing with a scheduling conflict rather than a life they'd created. She left his office, took his car keys without asking, and drove to the clinic he'd implicitly directed her toward. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and choices that couldn't be unmade. Fluorescent lights turned everyone's skin the same shade of exhausted. A magazine sat on the table beside her. Business Weekly glossy cover featuring corporate turnaround success stories. She flipped through absently, not really seeing the words until one article stopped her hand mid-turn. Revolutionary Restructuring: How Ashford Energy Saved Millions. The byline read, by Dorian Ashford. Her strategies, her analysis, her 3 months of work distilled into his authorship. Not even a footnote mentioning her contribution. She'd known he was taking credit, had witnessed it in meetings and presentations and conversations where her invisible labor propped up his visible success. But seeing it printed permanent, her intellect erased completely that crystallized something. Scarlett stood magazine still in her hand and walked out of the clinic. The pregnancy would end naturally 2 weeks later, her body making the choice that circumstances had already dictated. Dorian expressed relief thinly disguised as sympathy, then returned to IPO preparations. She didn't mourn what was lost. Mourning required the luxury of being surprised by cruelty, and that particular innocence had died somewhere between the altar and this moment. Instead, she started documenting. Every meeting where Dorian presented her work as his own, every strategy she developed that he claimed, every conversation where he'd dismissed her intelligence while harvesting its fruits. She bought a new phone on a cash account he didn't know about, started recording meetings after ensuring Texas was a one-party consent state, saved emails, kept copies of her original proposals alongside his rebranded versions. Not because she had a plan, because instinct whispered that evidence was armor, and she was going to need all the protection she could construct. The second year of marriage was a masterclass in systematic erasure. Dorian had perfected the art of making her smaller without ever raising his voice. Public affection paired with private contempt. Praise for her appearance coupled with dismissal of her thoughts. She attended charity galas and smiled for cameras. Organized events that raised millions for causes she couldn't afford to care about because caring required energy she was spending on survival. At night, she studied. Online courses in forensic accounting through the University of Houston completed under a pseudonym because Dorian would have questions about why his wife needed to understand financial crime. She learned to read balance sheets for lies, to spot inconsistencies in reporting, to identify the subtle ways numbers could be manipulated to present fiction as fact. And when she applied that education to Ashford Energy's books accessible through her executive assistant credentials that Dorian had never bothered to restrict, she found an empire built on sand and fraud. Cooked books, inflated asset valuations, bribed regulators, stolen intellectual property from smaller companies that couldn't afford to sue. Dorian hadn't built his success. He'd stolen it piece by piece from people who'd made the mistake of trusting him, people like her. The discovery should have shocked her. Instead, it settled like final confirmation of what she'd already known in her bones. The man she'd married was exactly who Natalia had warned her about. She'd just been too arrogant to listen. Scarlett found Griffin Harlow on a Tuesday in October, 3rd year of her marriage. He'd been her father's last employer before cancer had taken him, a self-made oil tycoon who'd retired to his West Texas ranch, and the kind of peace that came from having nothing left to prove. She drove 4 hours to reach his property past Austin's sprawl into genuine countryside where cattle outnumbered people and opinions. Griffin answered his own door, 67 years old and still carrying himself like someone who'd built empires with his bare hands. His handshake was firm, eyes sharp enough to cut through whatever stories she'd prepared. "Scarlett Nash, you look like your father." The observation landed with more weight than genetics. Her father had worked for Griffin 20 years ago, brilliant engineer who'd died before seeing his daughter graduate college. They sat on his porch, sweet tea, sweating in the heat that refused to acknowledge autumn. "Your father was brilliant. Dorian Ashford used him too." Griffin's voice carried no inflection, just fact delivered without ceremony. "Took his designs, fired him before royalties kicked in. Your dad died bitter and broke patents he'd developed, making millions for a man who'd erased his name from the paperwork." Scarlett's hands tightened around her glass. "I didn't know. Most people don't. That's how men like Dorian operate. Take the credit, bury the source, move forward like theft is just smart business." "Sound familiar?" Griffin's smile was thin. I've been watching you, watching what he does to you. Same pattern, different victim. She hadn't come here for sympathy. Sympathy was kindness without utility. I want to destroy him. Good. You should. Griffin set down his tea, leaned forward with the focus of a man who'd spent decades understanding power. But destruction isn't enough. You need to replace him. Take everything he built on other people's bones and make it yours. I don't have resources. You have intelligence, you have proximity, and now you have me. His eyes held calculation she recognized from her own mirror. I'll invest. 10 million to start. But you'll earn every penny by being smarter than him, harder working than him, and patient enough to strike when he's too arrogant to see you coming. They talked until sunset, strategy forming between them like architecture built from revenge and righteousness in equal measure. The third year of marriage ended with Scarlett quietly accumulating power Dorian would never notice. She bought Ashford Energy stock in small increments through shell companies Griffin helped establish. Nothing large enough to trigger disclosure requirements, just steady, patient accumulation of ownership in the empire her husband believed he controlled. She copied files, recorded conversations, built a cathedral of evidence documenting every crime, every theft, every moment of fraud that Dorian had committed on his path to wealth. And when she had enough, when the weight of documentation felt sufficient to crush him, she made an anonymous submission to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Investigation took 6 months. SEC agents arrived at Ashford Energy headquarters with warrants and questions. Dorian hired lawyers who cost more than houses and spun narratives about misunderstandings and accounting complexities. The investigation concluded with insufficient evidence to prosecute. Dorian survived reputation bruised but not broken, convinced he'd dodged consequences through skill rather than luck. He never suspected his wife had been the one who'd pulled the trigger. Never imagined the woman he'd dismissed and diminished possessed the capacity for calculated destruction. Scarlett watched him celebrate his narrow escape champagne and victory cigars with lawyers who'd successfully muddied waters she'd spent months clarifying. She smiled, kissed him, played the supportive wife who was relieved the nightmare was over. And in her private moments in the office he never visited, and the life he never bothered to examine, she prepared for the real war. Year 4 began with a pitch Scarlett made over breakfast. Casual, unimportant. Just an idea she'd had about renewable energy positioning. Dorian listened with half his attention, the other half on emails that apparently couldn't wait through coffee. Adorable. But stick to what you know, sweetheart. Let me handle the strategic vision. She nodded, made note of the date and time. 3 weeks later, Dorian presented his revolutionary new direction to the board, renewable energy division representing $800 million in investment. Every word she'd said, every projection she had calculated, every risk assessment she'd mapped. His voice, his vision, his success. The board approved unanimously. Dorian received a $50 million bonus for innovative thinking. That night he came home with a jewelry box from Tiffany, 100,000 in diamonds arranged to look like affection. Thanks for being supportive, baby. This success is partly yours. Partly. Scarlett accepted the bracelet, let him fasten it around her wrist, felt the weight of it like shackles disguised as gifts. She wore it to dinner, smiled appropriately, said the correct words of gratitude. And the next morning she contacted a divorce attorney who specialized in high-net-worth separations where one party had significantly more to lose than they realized. The attorney's office occupied the 42nd floor of a building that competed with Ashford Tower for dominance of Houston's skyline. Margaret Chen had a reputation for dismantling marriages that men thought were ironclad, finding fractures in prenuptial agreements that lawyers had believed were bulletproof. She reviewed Scarlett's prenup with the focus of a surgeon examining malignant tissue. You signed this 3 years ago, 4 months before the wedding. His lawyers gave me 72 hours to review. Margaret's expression didn't change, but her pen moved faster across her legal pad. Standard intimidation tactic. You get $2 million, no equity, no ongoing support. I know. Do you understand that means you're walking away with essentially nothing? His net worth is estimated at $3 billion. $2 million is rounding error. Scarlett leaned forward, hands flat on expensive mahogany. "I'm not interested in his money, Margaret. I'm interested in his company." That got attention. Margaret set down her pen, full focus, engaged. "Explain." "I own 12% of Ashford Energy through shell corporations he doesn't know about. I have documentation of systematic fraud spanning 6 years. I have recordings of him stealing intellectual property, including mine. And I have a plan to take controlling interest before he realizes I'm a threat instead of an accessory." Margaret smiled, sharp and professional. "Then we're not filing for divorce settlement. We're filing the opening move in a corporate acquisition." The papers were drafted with surgical precision. Scarlett reviewed every clause, every comma, every word that would transform her from wife to adversary. She chose a Friday to deliver them, late afternoon when Dorian's guard was lowest and his arrogance highest. Walked into his office at Ashford Tower, 68th floor, view of Houston, spread like conquered territory. He looked up from his screen, mildly annoyed at interruption. She placed the envelope on his desk, expensive paper and legal weight. "What's this?" "Divorce papers." His expression shifted from annoyance to confusion to something approximating amusement. "Scarlett, if you're upset about something—" "I'm not upset. I'm done." He opened the envelope, scanned the first page, then laughed. Actually laughed, the sound carrying genuine mirth at a joke only he understood. "You signed a prenup, sweetheart. You get $2 million. That's it." "I know." "Then what's the angle you think you can negotiate for more because my lawyers will eat your lawyers alive?" She waited until he finished, until his confidence was fully deployed and vulnerable. "I'm not taking your money, Dorian. I'm taking your company." His smile faltered. "With what? You have nothing. I have everything. You just never bothered to look." She turned, walked toward the door, felt his eyes on her back, trying to decode what he'd just heard. "Scarlett?" She paused, didn't turn around. "You can't be serious." "See you in court." The door closed behind her with the soft click of a lock engaging. She rode the elevator down 68 floors, walked through the lobby where security guards nodded respectfully at Mrs. Ashford, and stepped into Houston's humidity with the first genuine breath she'd taken in 4 years. Behind her, somewhere in that tower, Dorian was likely still sitting at his desk, trying to calculate the equation of a woman he'd never actually seen. He'd figure it out eventually. By then it would be far too late. Austin greeted Scarlett with the kind of heat that turned ambition into sweat and determination into something harder. 2 hours from Houston, close enough to strike but far enough to rebuild without Dorian's shadow contaminating every breath. The condo she rented occupied the 4th floor of a building that had seen better decades, paint peeling where charm had once lived, air conditioning that worked in theory more than practice. 32 years old and starting over with $2 million that felt simultaneously like fortune and insult. The money sat in an account she'd opened under her maiden name, Nash, a return to identity that predated the mistake of becoming Mrs. Ashford. The divorce had been finalized with efficiency that surprised no one. Dorian's lawyers had strutted into mediation expecting warfare, found Scarlett's attorney asking for exactly what the prenup stipulated, and declared victory before understanding they'd won nothing that mattered. Dorian himself had seemed almost disappointed by the lack of fight. She'd signed papers with the detachment of someone closing a failed business venture, shook hands with lawyers who thought they'd crushed her, and walked out of that conference room with everything she actually needed. The evidence, the recordings, the documentation of fraud that the SEC had been too cautious to prosecute on first submission, but would find considerably more compelling with additional context she was still assembling. And 12% of Ashford Energy hidden behind shell corporations, registered in Delaware and Nevada paperwork so thoroughly buried that Dorian's forensic accountants would need months to uncover what she'd accumulated while he'd been too busy performing success to notice actual theft. Griffin Harlow's ranch became her war room. The drive from Austin to his West Texas property took 3 hours through landscape that refused to pretend it was anything but honest scrub brush and cattle and sky that went on until it hit different sky. His study smelled like leather and old money walls lined with books that had been read rather than displayed. Maps covered the conference table he'd installed specifically for her use. Not geographical maps, corporate architecture. Ashford Energy's supply chain rendered in colored lines and dependency nodes. Every vendor, every contractor, every relationship that kept Dorian's empire functioning. Griffin stood at the window, coffee in hand, 70-something years old, and still sharper than men half his age. The morning light caught the gray in his hair, made him look like what he was, survivor of 50 years in industry that ate the weak. Your father would be proud. The words landed with more weight than compliment. Her father had died broke and bitter genius, erased by men who understood that theft was only crime when poor people did it. My father died believing he'd failed. He didn't fail. He was robbed. There's a difference. Griffin turned from the window, focus settling on her with the intensity of someone who'd spent decades reading people for profit. But you're not going to die broke, and you're sure as hell not going to die erased. We're going to make sure of that. The plan they'd been developing had elegant simplicity, hiding vicious complexity. Ashford Energy depended on suppliers and contractors and relationships built over decades. Those relationships weren't loyal, they were transactional. Find the right pressure points, offer better terms, extract defections that would bleed Dorian's operation slowly enough that he'd mistake symptoms for market forces rather than coordinated attack. Scarlett spent 6 months executing the first phase. Nash Strategic Group launched with 3 employees and office space in Austin's business district that cost less than Dorian spent on coffee. The consulting firm's initial clients were small energy startups needing market analysis, regional operators seeking efficiency improvements. But each engagement was calculated. Each client she helped became testimony to her competence. Each success built reputation that would matter when larger prey came into range. Marcus Vance materialized 8 months into her rebuild. Old money from Houston, 71 years old, with hands that had signed contracts worth billions and eyes that had watched empires collapse with equal indifference. His Permian Pipeline LLC supplied 60% of Ashford Energy's crude transport. Their meeting happened in San Antonio steakhouse that catered to men who measured success in mineral rights. Vance ordered bourbon, gestured for her to choose whatever she wanted, and got directly to the point. Griffin says you're worth my time. Prove it. Scarlett opened her tablet, pulled up analysis she'd spent 6 weeks perfecting. Your Permian contract with Ashford Energy undervalues your infrastructure by 37% compared to current market rates. You're leaving $18 million annually on the table because the contract was negotiated 8 years ago under different conditions. Vance's expression didn't change, but his fingers stopped their rhythmic tap against crystal. Additionally, Ashford has been routing 22% of contracted volume through alternative pipelines, violating minimum usage clauses while you absorb fixed infrastructure costs. You could sue for breach, but litigation would take 3 years and cost more than you'd recover. She slid the tablet across white linen. I can get you out of that contract with cause renegotiate terms at current market rates with a different operator and increase your annual revenue by $34 million. Timeline is 14 months. What's your fee? 10% of first-year increased revenue, $3.4 million. That's aggressive. That's fair compensation for solving a problem you didn't know you could solve. Vance studied her over the rim of expensive glass. You used to be married to Dorian Ashford. 4 years, divorced 10 months ago. Bitter divorce, clarifying divorce. She met his eyes without deflection. I learned exactly who I'd married, adjusted accordingly. His laugh was brief and genuine. I like you, Ms. Nash. You have 60 days to prove you can deliver what you're promising. The Permian extraction consumed the next year of her life. Legal leverage through contract clauses Dorian had violated. Financial incentive through market analysis proving Vance was being exploited. Political pressure through connections Griffin provided to regulators who found Ashford's routing arrangements conveniently interesting. When the extraction finally executed, it happened with quiet efficiency. Permian Pipeline terminated their contract with Ashford Energy for cause. Dorian's lawyers threatened litigation. Vance's lawyers presented documentation so thorough that threats evaporated into negotiated exit. Ashford Energy's stock dropped 4 points on the news. Not catastrophic, just enough to register as problem rather than fluctuation. Scarlett was in her Austin office when her phone rang with a number she recognized despite having deleted the contact months ago. She answered on the third ring. "Scarlett?" Dorian's voice carried confusion wrapped in anger. "We need to talk." "Do we about the Permian situation? That was you. That was market forces recognizing better opportunities. Capitalism, Dorian. I thought you believed in it." Silence stretched long enough that she could hear him calculating, reassessing, trying to reconcile the woman he'd dismissed with the strategist who'd just cost him infrastructure access. "What's your end game here?" "Success. Same as yours. Just turns out I'm better at it." She hung up before he could respond. Set the phone down with hands that didn't shake because she'd learned years ago that showing weakness was invitation for exploitation, but the victory was temporary. 3 days later, Ben knocked on her office door with expression that suggested bad news wrapped in urgency. "Ms. Nash, we have a problem. Wellington Energy just pulled their contract. $80 million over 3 years. They're citing budget constraints, but the timing is suspicious." Scarlett's stomach turned cold. Wellington had been her largest client, anchor revenue that was funding expansion plans and staff growth. "Get me their CFO on the phone." The call lasted 6 minutes. The CFO was apologetic but firm. "Board decision, nothing personal, strategic realignment." The words were professional lies covering something else. Scarlett could taste the manipulation underneath. She spent the next 4 hours making calls, gathering intelligence from contacts who owed her favors. By evening, the picture crystallized into sharp focus. Dorian had reached out to Wellington's board. Old relationships activated. Subtle pressure applied. The message was clear: work with Scarlett Nash and lose access to Ashford Energy's broader network. Nash Strategic Group's cash flow projections, which had been healthy that morning, now showed red by Q3. Without Wellington's revenue, she couldn't make payroll past October, couldn't fund the stock purchases she'd been methodically executing, couldn't maintain the momentum that was essential to her larger strategy. That night, alone in her condo with financial spreadsheets that refused to show acceptable solutions, Scarlett felt the weight of what she'd undertaken. $2 million in savings was disappearing faster than projected. Clients were being pressured to abandon her. Dorian had finally recognized her as threat rather than irrelevant ex-wife. Maybe she should cut losses. Sell the stock she'd accumulated, take the profit, probably $5 million at current prices, and walk away. Start something else. Somewhere else. Away from this war that was consuming resources faster than she could generate them. Her phone rang. Griffin's number. "You heard about Wellington?" "Ben called me." Griffin's voice carried no judgment, just acknowledgement of reality. "Dorian's playing defense now. Means you're hurting him." "I'm hurting myself. Cash flow is a disaster. I can't sustain this." "So you're thinking about quitting?" The words landed like accusation. Scarlett's jaw tightened. "I'm thinking about being realistic." "Realistic is what people call cowardice when they're trying to make it sound strategic." Griffin's voice hardened. "Your father gave up. Let Dorian crush him without fighting back. Died bitter and broken. That what you want? That's not fair. Fair doesn't exist in this world, Scarlett. Only people who fight and people who surrender. Which one are you?" She stared at the spreadsheet showing red numbers that represented failure in its most concrete form. "I don't have the capital to survive this." "Then borrow more. I'll loan you another $5 million, 6% interest. Use it to bridge cash flow, accelerate stock purchases while his price is depressed, hire the people you need to scale faster." "Griffin, if this fails, then we both lose money. But if you quit now, you definitely lose everything, including the chance to finish what your father started." His voice softened slightly. "He couldn't beat Dorian, but you can. You're smarter, more ruthless, and you've got backing he never had. Don't waste that." Scarlett closed the spreadsheet, opened a different file, the one tracking her shell company stock positions. 12% of Ashford Energy accumulated over 18 months of patient purchasing. If she doubled down now, borrowed Griffin's $5 million, pushed harder, instead of retreating, the risk was catastrophic. Complete financial ruin if Dorian successfully isolated her from clients and the SEC investigation fizzled again. But the alternative was accepting defeat, proving Dorian right, becoming another person he'd crushed and forgotten. Send the loan documents. I'll sign them tomorrow. Griffin's exhale suggested relief he hadn't wanted to show. Good. Now stop thinking about survival and start thinking about conquest. The next 6 months were warfare conducted through spreadsheets and boardrooms. Scarlett borrowed Griffin's $5 million and immediately spent $4 million of it buying more Ashford Energy stock. Prices had dropped to $63 on market concerns about the company's supply chain disruptions. She acquired another 3%, pushing her total position to 15%. She replaced Wellington's lost revenue by aggressively pursuing Dorian's competitors, offering consulting services at rates that barely covered costs but built relationships that would matter later. Her team grew from 3 to 8 talented analysts who'd been overlooked by larger firms and were hungry to prove themselves. And she started headhunting Dorian's executive team. Patricia Chen was first. His CFO for 6 years, brilliant woman who'd spent every one of those years watching Dorian take credit for her financial engineering. Scarlett offered her 40% salary increase and equity stake in Nash Strategic. Patricia accepted over dinner at Austin Restaurant where they could speak without being overheard. He's going to be furious. Let him be furious. You've been underpaid and undervalued for 6 years. Time someone recognized your actual worth. 2 months later, Dorian's head of acquisitions followed, then his director of regulatory compliance. One by one, the people who'd built his empire from behind the scenes discovered that Scarlett Nash paid better respected competence and had vision that extended beyond the next earnings call. Dorian noticed, had to notice. But his response was predictable, throwing money at people to stay loyal, making threats, trying to enforce non-compete agreements that wouldn't survive legal scrutiny. What he didn't do was look deeper, didn't investigate who was funding Scarlett's expansion, didn't examine his shareholder registry closely enough to spot the shell companies accumulating his stock, didn't recognize coordinated attack for what it was because his ego wouldn't allow him to believe his ex-wife possessed that kind of strategic sophistication. But someone in his organization was less blind. 14 months after the divorce, Scarlett received envelope at her office. No return address. Inside was single-page shareholder registry for Ashford Energy with 5 shell companies circled in red ink. Below them, handwritten note, "He's starting to look. Cover your tracks. A friend." Scarlett's hands went cold. Someone inside Dorian's operation had figured out what she was doing and was warning her. Friend or enemy playing longer games she couldn't know. She called Griffin immediately. "We have a problem. Someone spotted the shell companies. How much do they know? Enough to connect them to me if they dig deeper. We need to consolidate before Dorian's lawyers start filing disclosure demands." The corporate restructuring took 2 weeks of intense legal work. The 5 shell companies merged into single holding entity, Nash Holdings LLC, that crossed the 20% disclosure threshold. The SEC filing went public on a Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, Dorian's lawyers were on the phone demanding explanations. By Thursday, he called her directly. His voice was different this time, not confused, not angry, something colder. Calculated fury from someone who'd finally understood the scope of what she'd built while he'd been dismissing her. 20%. You own 20% of my company. Correction. I own 20% of Ashford Energy. You're just the CEO, for now. This is illegal, coordinated manipulation. The SEC will what I followed every disclosure rule. Purchased stock through legitimate channels. The fact that you were too arrogant to notice doesn't make my actions illegal. Just makes you incompetent. She could hear his breathing, sharp and controlled. The sound of a man who'd spent his life dominating negotiations, discovering what it felt like to be outmaneuvered. I underestimated you. Yes, you did, repeatedly, for 4 years of marriage and 18 months of divorce. That's a lot of underestimation, Dorian. Must be exhausting being wrong that consistently. This isn't over. You're right, it's not, but it's not going the direction you think. She hung up, hands shaking now from adrenaline rather than fear. The mask was off. Dorian knew she was coming for him. The question was whether she'd accumulated enough power to survive his counterattack. The answer came faster than expected. Within a week, Dorian hired private investigators to examine every aspect of her business, looking for fraud, for impropriety, for anything that could be weaponized into legal action or public scandal. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Every stock purchase had been legitimate, every client engagement above board, every employee hired through proper channels. But the investigation itself was message. Dorian was done underestimating. Now he was fighting. His next move was more sophisticated. He started calling in favors with institutional investors who held significant Ashford Energy positions, convinced 3 of them to file shareholder proposal demanding restrictions on hostile accumulation of stock by former insiders. The proposal would require shareholder vote. If it passed, Scarlett's ability to continue buying stock would be severely limited. She spent 2 weeks building counter-coalition, called every institutional investor she could reach, presented the argument that restricting stock purchases was transparent attempt by failing CEO to protect his position rather than serve shareholder interests. The vote happened at quarterly shareholder meeting. Dorian's proposal failed 53 to 47%, close enough to be terrifying, far enough to be victory. But the real breakthrough came from unexpected source. Patricia Armstrong called her on a Thursday evening. The board member who'd been coolly professional during Scarlett's few interactions with Ashford Energy's governance. "Ms. Nash, this is Patricia Armstrong. We should talk, privately." They met at Hotel Bar in Dallas Neutral Territory between Austin and Houston. Patricia was 73, elegant in the way that old money achieved through generations of practice. "I opposed your stock accumulation when it first came to my attention. Thought you were opportunistic ex-wife trying to extract revenge." Scarlett sipped water, waiting for the actual point. "But I've been watching you for 16 months now. The way you've built Nash Strategic, the talent you've recruited, the strategy you're executing. You're not opportunistic, you're competent. Possibly more competent than Dorian has ever been. Why are you telling me this?" Patricia's smile was thin and knowing. "Because Dorian approached me 3 weeks ago. Asked me to help him build board opposition to any future attempts you might make to gain operational control. Offered me considerations if I'd lead that opposition." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it." Patricia set down her wine, expression hardening. "But the truth is, I've spent 40 years watching men like Dorian Ashford claim credit for other people's work. I was one of those people once. Young woman with MBA from Wharton. Brilliant financial mind married to man who used my intelligence to build his career while keeping me decorative and quiet." The parallel was so obvious Scarlett didn't need to acknowledge it. "I see myself in you. The woman I could have been if I'd had the courage to fight back rather than just escape." Patricia leaned forward. "So here's what I'm going to do. When the moment comes, and it will come when you need board support to remove Dorian and install new leadership, I'm voting with you, and I'll bring at least 2 other board members with me. Why? Because watching you dismantle him is the closest I'll ever get to dismantling the man who did the same thing to me 40 years ago." Patricia's voice carried weight of decades. "Win this, Scarlett, not for revenge, for all of us who didn't." The SEC's second investigation of Dorian Ashford launched 3 weeks later. Anonymous submission, they said, 217 pages of documentation, 43 audio recordings, 12,000 emails, forensic accounting analysis from 3 separate firms. Scarlett had timed delivery to coincide with quarterly earnings announcement. Ashford Energy was scheduled to report results on Monday. The SEC would need at least 2 weeks to review evidence, probably 4 weeks to decide on charges, which meant indictment would land right as Dorian was trying to explain to investors why revenue had declined for 3rd consecutive quarter. She watched the news break from her Austin office. CNBC running banner, SEC files charges against Ashford Energy CEO. 17 counts of securities fraud, 11 counts of wire fraud, 8 counts of bribery, 36 felony counts. Conservative estimate was 15 years federal prison if convicted on all charges. Her phone started ringing immediately. Board members who'd been cordial in previous conversations now sounding panicked and desperate for guidance. She gave them the same advice: calm and consistent, wait for facts, cooperate fully with investigation, focus on business continuity. What she didn't say, I'm the solution you're looking for, didn't need to. They'd figure it out. But Dorian apparently had one final move. He called an emergency shareholder meeting for the following week. Agenda: vote to authorize $50 million legal defense fund and reaffirm board's confidence in current leadership. It was desperate play, trying to rally shareholders around him before the SEC evidence became public, before the full scope of his fraud was undeniable. The meeting happened in Houston Ashford Tower's main auditorium. Scarlett attended as shareholder with 20% stake, sat in the back watching Dorian take the stage wearing confidence that looked increasingly like costume. These charges are baseless. Political persecution of successful businessman. The SEC has been weaponized by people who want to tear down American innovation. The speech was predictable. Deny, deflect, wrap himself in capitalism's flag. Some shareholders nodded. Many looked skeptical. Then came the vote on legal defense fund. Before anyone could raise hands, Scarlett stood. Point of order. I'd like to speak. Dorian's face went rigid. The chairman, Harold Westbrook, looked uncertain. Ms. Nash, this isn't an open forum. I own 20% of this company. That's larger position than anyone in this room except Mr. Ashford himself. I'm entitled to speak. Harold consulted with attorney, nodded reluctantly. Scarlett walked to the microphone set up in the aisle. 500 faces turned toward her. I've reviewed the SEC's evidence, all of it. It's not baseless, it's meticulous. It documents systematic fraud spanning 6 years, inflated asset valuations, bribed regulators, stolen intellectual property. Murmurs rippled through the auditorium. Mr. Ashford isn't a victim of political persecution. He's architect of criminal enterprise disguised as energy company. And if we authorize $50 million to defend him, we're not protecting shareholder value. We're subsidizing his personal legal defense with money that should be protecting this company's future. Dorian's voice cut through. This is vindictive attack from bitter ex-wife. This is assessment from someone who spent 4 years watching you operate, who documented your crimes while you were too arrogant to notice, who submitted the evidence to the SEC because fraud at this scale couldn't be allowed to continue. The room erupted. Shareholders shouting questions. Board members looking panicked. Harold banging gavel trying to restore order. In the chaos, Scarlett returned to her seat. The vote on the legal defense fund failed 62 to 38%. The vote to reaffirm confidence in Dorian's leadership failed even worse. By end of day, board had suspended him pending investigation. By end of week, they were calling Scarlett. Harold Westbrook's voice came through her phone at 4:17 p.m. Ms. Nash, the board would like to speak with you. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Houston headquarters. Regarding the future of this company and your potential role in it. She agreed to the meeting, hung up, and allowed herself 30 seconds of something that resembled victory before returning to the work that would determine whether potential became reality. The boardroom occupied the entire 69th floor, windows on all sides, offering views that suggested dominance over landscape that didn't actually care. 12 board members sat around a table that could have hosted 30. Harold Westbrook gestured to a chair positioned at the end. Ms. Nash, thank you for coming. She sat, arranged her materials with deliberate calm. The board is facing unprecedented crisis. Our CEO is under federal indictment. Stock is down 43% since charges were filed. Institutional investors are demanding answers we don't have. Scarlett waited, understanding that speaking too soon would position her as desperate rather than confident. Patricia Armstrong leaned forward. You've built impressive company in 3 years. Your firm has revenue approaching $400 million. That makes us wonder why you'd want to take on this disaster. Because disaster is opportunity for anyone brave enough to embrace it. She opened her laptop connected to the presentation system. Ashford Energy is fundamentally sound business built on corrupt foundation. The assets are real. The infrastructure is valuable. The client relationships are salvageable. What's corrupt is the leadership. Slides showing Dorian's fraudulent practices appeared behind her. She didn't linger, they'd seen the indictment. I propose complete restructuring focused on transparency, sustainability, and competence-based advancement. We cooperate fully with federal investigation, accept penalties, implement compliance systems. We pivot toward renewable energy, divesting legacy assets facing regulatory headwinds. We promote based on performance rather than loyalty. Financial projections appeared, 3-year timeline for transformation. This will be painful. Short-term losses to build long-term sustainability. Harold's fingers drummed against mahogany. What makes you think you can execute this? You're 33 years old. You've never run a company this size. Personal history gave me intimate knowledge of exactly how he corrupted this organization. Yes, I'm young. Yes, I'm inexperienced at this scale. But I'm also the only candidate who understands what needs to be fixed and has no personal stake in protecting people who enabled his crimes. Patricia Armstrong broke the silence. What's your stock position? The disclosure she'd been waiting for. 25%, accumulated over 3 years. Several board members exchanged looks. You've been planning this. I've been preparing for opportunity. I would have moved regardless. This company deserves better leadership. Harold leaned back, studying her. The board will deliberate. You'll have our decision by end of day. The call came at 6:47 p.m. Harold's voice carried formal weight. The board has voted. Pending shareholder approval and federal clearance, we're offering you the position of CEO effective immediately. Scarlett closed her laptop, processed the culmination of 3 years of planning and 4 years of suffering that had preceded it. I accept. Federal Correctional Institution. Beaumont sat 2 hours northeast of Houston, concrete and razor wire housing men whose ambition had metastasized into crime. Scarlett made the drive on a Saturday morning when Texas heat was building momentum toward the kind of afternoon that reminded people why air conditioning represented civilization's genuine achievement. The parking lot was half full with vehicles belonging to families who'd made peace with loving people who'd made catastrophic choices. Scarlett's rental she'd flown into Houston the night before looked too new among the older sedans and trucks that spoke to economic realities of maintaining relationships with incarcerated relatives. She'd dressed carefully, not the power suit she wore to board meetings, not casual enough to suggest she'd stopped taking him seriously. Simple black dress, minimal jewelry, the uniform of someone who'd moved beyond needing to prove anything. Security procedures took 40 minutes. Metal detector, ID verification, form signing that acknowledged she understood facility rules and consequences of violating them. Guard who looked like he'd processed 10,000 visitors and found none of them particularly interesting asked if she was attorney or family. Neither. Former spouse. His expression suggested that category presented its own complexities he'd learned not to inquire about. The visiting room divided humanity into those behind glass and those in front of it. Dorian sat at Station 7 orange jumpsuit, replacing the bespoke suits that had been his armor against a world that rarely questioned men who looked successful. 41 years old and already showing the wear of 18 months in federal custody, hair grayer, face harder, eyes carrying the specific exhaustion of someone who'd finally run out of room to maneuver. He picked up the phone on his side of the glass. She picked up hers. For 10 seconds, neither spoke. Just assessment across bulletproof barrier that represented more than physical separation. Finally, Dorian's voice came through the receiver, stripped of the confidence that had once made boardrooms bend to his vision. "Thank you for coming." Scarlett waited. Not her job to make this easier. "I've had a lot of time to think. About what I did. About what I lost." His hand that wasn't holding the phone rested on the narrow counter fingers, drumming pattern that suggested nervous energy seeking outlet. "You took everything from me." "No. You lost everything when you chose fraud over ethics. I just stopped pretending your choices weren't criminal." Same result. Completely different process. She leaned forward slightly, voice carrying the kind of calm that came from having already won. "You built an empire on theft. From my father. From me. From every employee whose ideas you claimed, and every investor whose money you stole. The federal government took your freedom. I took the company you corrupted. Those aren't equivalent. Dorian's jaw tightened. 2 years ago, that expression would have preceded cutting remarks designed to make her feel small. Now it just looked like impotent frustration from someone who'd discovered that manipulation required leverage he no longer possessed. I loved you. The words landed with the impact of currency that had lost all value. Scarlett studied his face, searching for sincerity, finding instead the calculated performance of man who still believed the right words could purchase desired outcomes. No, Dorian. You loved what I could do for you. The strategies I developed, the ideas I generated, the competence I provided while you took credit and convinced yourself you'd earned accomplishments I'd handed you. That's not true. It's completely true. You loved me the way people love tools, useful until they're not disposable when something better comes along. She paused, letting that truth settle between them. The difference is, I finally recognized my value wasn't determined by your ability to see it. His expression shifted into something that resembled genuine confusion, as if the concept of her possessing independent worth remained fundamentally incomprehensible. I made you, gave you access, taught you how this world works. Scarlett's laugh was brief and utterly without humor. You taught me how corruption works, how to steal and lie and manipulate. Those were valuable lessons, just not in the way you intended. She reached into her bag, pulled out envelope she'd brought specifically for this moment, pressed it against the glass. Inside, visible through white paper, was a single photograph. Dorian squinted, trying to see details through barriers of glass and envelope. That's a picture of the pawn shop where you forced me to sell my mother's locket. 3 years into our marriage, when you decided I needed to understand that sentiment was weakness and attachment was luxury I couldn't afford. His face showed recognition. The memory existed in his history, probably filed under necessary lessons he'd taught wife who'd needed toughening. I bought it back. First major deal I closed for Nash Strategic. I walked into that pawn shop and paid 4 times what they'd given me. It sits on my nightstand now. Reminder that some things are priceless, and I'm one of them. She flipped the envelope, showed him the back where she'd written in her own hand, paid in full. That's what this visit is. Final payment on debt you didn't know you owed. I came here to show you what became of the woman you dismissed. Not to gloat, not to forgive, just to close the ledger. Dorian's composure cracked enough to show the rage underneath. You're enjoying this, seeing me in here while you run my company. Your company was built on fraud. I run a legitimate business that happens to use the same infrastructure. Her voice remained level factual. And no, I'm not enjoying this. I'm completing it. There's a difference. What happens when I get out? The question carried implications of threat, as if 7 years from now, when parole became possible, he'd emerge ready to reclaim what she'd taken. Scarlett's smile was thin and utterly without warmth. In 7 years, assuming you make parole, you'll be 48 years old. Convicted felon, barred from serving as officer or director of any public company. Your professional network will have moved on. Your reputation will be permanently destroyed, and Nash Energy will be worth $20 billion under leadership that doesn't rely on theft. She leaned closer to the glass voice, dropping to register that required him to strain to hear through the phone. You'll get out, Dorian. You'll rebuild some smaller life. Maybe you'll find another woman to manipulate, another company to corrupt. But you'll never touch what I've built, because I learned from you. I learned that the only way to protect yourself from predators is to become apex predator yourself. His hand curled into fist against the counter. Guard in the corner shifted position, attention focusing on Station 7, where emotional temperature was rising into territory that sometimes preceded incidents. Scarlett stood preparing to leave. Dorian's voice came through the phone, stripped of performance and pretense, carrying the kind of desperation that comes from recognizing too late what was lost. I'm sorry for what I did, for what I took from you. She paused, hand on the phone, considering whether the apology deserved acknowledgement. You took 4 years. I took your empire. We're not even close to even, but we're done. She set the phone down, gently breaking connection before he could respond. Walking out, she didn't look back. Didn't need to. The image of him sitting behind that glass would stay exactly where it belonged in past that had taught her everything about who not to become. The drive back to Houston took longer than the drive out, traffic thickening as afternoon stretched toward evening. Scarlett stopped at a roadside diner 40 miles from the prison, needed coffee and distance from the emotional weight of facing the man who'd shaped her understanding of power and its abuse. The waitress was 60-something with the kind of efficient kindness that comes from decades of reading customers' moods and responding accordingly. Brought coffee without being asked, gave her menu and space in equal measure. Scarlett's phone buzzed. Text from Ben, her assistant, who was supposed to be enjoying weekend but apparently couldn't disconnect from work any more than she could. Bloomberg running story Monday. Nash Energy doubles revenue in 18 months under new leadership. Thought you'd want heads up. Revenue growth was real. $2 billion to $4 billion in a year and a half through combination of Dorian's fraud being eliminated and Scarlett's legitimate strategy being implemented. Divesting failing divisions. Investing in renewable infrastructure. Treating employees like assets worth developing rather than resources to exploit. The transformation hadn't been clean. 53 executives terminated for complicity in fraud schemes. 2 divisions sold at loss because corruption had made them unsalvageable. 3 months of federal cooperation that included turning over documents that implicated people Dorian had considered allies. But the company that emerged was fundamentally different. Transparent, sustainable, built on competence rather than theft. She typed response, "Thanks. Prep standard response about focusing on long-term value creation rather than quarterly performance." The coffee was better than it had any right to be. Scarlett sat in the booth watching traffic pass on the highway, pickup trucks and sedans carrying people toward destinations that probably didn't involve confronting their worst decisions in federal prison visiting rooms. Her phone rang. Not text this time. Actual call from number she recognized as Griffin's Ranch. "How'd it go?" Direct question from man who'd earned the right to ask it. Like closing a chapter that should have ended years ago. Griffin's exhale suggested understanding. "Did you get what you needed?" "I got confirmation that he hasn't changed. Still believes the world owes him something. Still can't comprehend that actions have consequences." She sipped coffee, considering whether the visit had actually served purpose beyond symbolic closure. "But yeah, I got what I needed. Permission to stop thinking about him." "Good. Because you have actual problems that require attention." Her posture straightened, professional instincts engaging. "What problems?" "Boards getting pressure from shareholders who want faster returns. Some of them are agitating for dividend distributions rather than continued infrastructure investment. Patricia Armstrong called me this morning, asked if I'd support motion to redirect capital allocation." Patricia Armstrong, board member who'd been cautiously supportive during Scarlett's ascension, but never fully committed. Old money with old ideas about how companies should prioritize existing shareholders over long-term transformation. "What did you tell her?" "Told her I'd consider it, but I'm calling you first because you need to know this fight is coming. You've had 18 months of goodwill for cleaning up Dorian's mess. That goodwill is expiring. Now you have to prove you can actually grow the company, not just stop it from bleeding." The coffee turned bitter in her mouth. She'd known this moment would arrive, had prepared for it during strategy sessions and quarterly reviews. But intellectual preparation differed from emotional readiness for battle with people who controlled billions and saw her as temporary placeholder rather than permanent solution. "Board meeting is scheduled for next month. I'll have growth strategy ready that addresses their concerns while maintaining infrastructure investment. Make it compelling, because if you lose this vote, you lose credibility. And if you lose credibility, they'll start looking for your replacement." They talked for another 10 minutes about specific board members and their leverage points, the kind of strategic calculation that Scarlett had learned from watching Dorian manipulate power before learning to do it better. Hanging up, she signaled for the check-left cash tip that was probably excessive, but felt like small kindness in universe that rarely distributed them, and headed back to Houston, where her hotel room and laptop waited. The growth strategy consumed her weekend. Not the weekend she'd planned that had involved actual rest and possibly remembering what hobbies felt like. Instead, she spent Saturday night and all of Sunday building presentation that would either secure her position or begin the process of losing it. Nash Energy had two paths forward. Conservative approach meant dividend distribution, slower growth, satisfying current shareholders at expense of future positioning. Aggressive approach meant continued infrastructure investment, renewable energy, expansion, accepting short-term earnings, pressure for long-term market dominance. Scarlett had already chosen aggressive. Question was whether she could convince the board to trust her judgment over their quarterly return preferences. Monday morning meant flying back to Austin, arriving at her office by 8 a.m., gathering her executive team for preview of board presentation. Patricia Chen, her CFO who'd defected from Dorian's regime and never looked back, reviewed the financial projections with the skepticism of someone who'd seen too many strategies fail at intersection of ambition and arithmetic. The numbers work if everything goes according to plan, but you're asking the board to approve $2 billion in capital expenditure for renewable projects that won't generate positive returns for 4 years. That's asking a lot from people who measure success in quarters, not presidential terms. Then we change how they measure success. Patricia's expression suggested that strategy qualified as optimistic to the point of delusion. These are billionaires who became billionaires by focusing on returns. You're not going to reprogram their DNA in one presentation. I'm not trying to reprogram them. I'm trying to show them that their current strategy guarantees obsolescence. Oil and gas is dying industry. Not tomorrow, not next year, but inevitably. We can be last company standing in declining market, or we can be first mover in emerging one. Her head of renewable development, Marcus Yates, who'd come from a solar startup that couldn't scale but had brilliant technical vision, nodded agreement. The technology is there. The market demand is accelerating. The only question is whether we have courage to pivot while we still have capital and credibility. Scarlett spent the next hour drilling with her team on possible board objections and responses. By the time she dismissed them, she'd refined the strategy into something that might survive contact with hostile questioning. The board meeting happened in Dallas neutral territory between Houston's old guard and Austin's new energy. Same boardroom where she'd been offered the CEO position 18 months ago. Same faces around the table, different power dynamics now that honeymoon period had expired. Harold Westbrook called meeting to order with the efficiency of someone who'd chaired boards since before Scarlett was born. First order of business Q3 performance review, Scarlett. She stood, connected her laptop to the presentation system, pulled up slides that told story of controlled transformation. Revenue is up 37% year over year. Operating margin improved from 11% to 17% through efficiency gains and elimination of fraudulent cost structures. Stock price has recovered from post-indictment low of $42 to current $78. Numbers on screen supported narrative of competent turnaround. Board members nodded, satisfied with evidence that their gamble on young CEO was paying dividends. Then Scarlett advanced to the slide that would determine whether satisfaction transformed into continued support or calcified into resistance. However, we're at inflection point. Oil and gas assets that currently generate 80% of revenue face systematic headwinds. Regulatory pressure, market saturation, competition from renewables that have achieved cost parity in most markets. Patricia Armstrong's posture shifted into defensive positioning, preparation for argument she'd apparently been rehearsing. We can continue optimizing legacy operations and return maximum value to current shareholders through dividends. That strategy guarantees steady decline over next decade until we're acquired or irrelevant. Slide showing revenue projection under conservative strategy appeared. Flat line that gradually sloped downward, ending 10 years out at 60% of current level. Or we can invest aggressively in renewable infrastructure, now accept short-term earnings pressure, and position ourselves as market leader in energy transition. Alternative projection showed dip over next 3 years, then sharp growth that exceeded current revenue by year 6. Patricia Armstrong couldn't contain herself. You're asking us to sacrifice certain returns for speculative growth in market that's already crowded with competitors. I'm asking you to choose between certain decline and probable dominance. Scarlett met her eyes without deflection. The renewable market is crowded but immature. First movers with capital and expertise will consolidate. We have both. What we need is willingness to invest when the opportunity exists, rather than waiting until competitors have established positions we can't overcome. Another board member, Thomas Kirkland, who'd made his fortune in natural gas, leaned forward. What's the specific ask? $2 billion in capital expenditure over next 18 months. Wind farms in West Texas, solar installations in Arizona and New Mexico, battery storage facilities to manage grid integration. We'll finance half through debt, half through retained earnings rather than dividends. The room erupted into conversation. Board members debating merits and risks, some seeing vision she'd articulated, others seeing reckless gambling with their money. Harold let the discussion run for 5 minutes before calling for order. We'll need to vote on this, but first I want to hear from Griffin. Griffin Harlow had been mostly silent during the presentation, 70-something years old and long past needing to prove anything to anyone. When he spoke, the room quieted because his voice carried weight of experience that couldn't be purchased or performed. I've been in energy business for 50 years, watched companies rise and fall based on whether they adapted or resisted change. Coal barons who thought their dominance was permanent. Oil majors who dismissed natural gas as niche market. Natural gas producers who can't see that renewable transition is inevitable. He paused, letting those examples settle into minds of people who'd witnessed those failures themselves. Scarlett is right. We're at inflection point. We can optimize decline or invest in transformation. I've seen both strategies. Only one survives. He looked directly at Patricia Armstrong. I'm voting for the $2 billion investment, and I'm committing personal capital another $500 million to co-invest in the renewable projects. That's how confident I am in this strategy. $500 million from Griffin wasn't just money. It was credibility transfer from someone the board respected to someone they were still evaluating. The vote happened 30 minutes later after additional discussion that covered risk mitigation and timeline specifics. 9 in favor, 3 opposed. Not unanimous, but sufficient majority to proceed. Scarlett gathered her materials while board members filed out some offering congratulations, others maintaining skeptical silence that suggested she'd bought time rather than one commitment. Harold approached her as the room emptied. You have 18 months to show results. If renewable division isn't trending toward profitability, by then the board will reconsider. Understood. Understood. Good, because that was probably the last time Griffin's endorsement saves you. Next time, you'll need to stand on your own record. She appreciated the honesty, better than false encouragement or ambiguous support. Flying back to Austin that evening, Scarlett processed the implications of what she'd just secured. $2 billion to transform the company, 18 months to prove the strategy worked, and board that would be watching every quarterly result looking for evidence that their faith was justified or misplaced. The next year moved with the relentless momentum of promises that needed delivering. Construction crews breaking ground on wind farms in West Texas counties where land was cheap and wind was constant. Solar panels arriving in Arizona warehouses before installation on 500 acres that would generate enough electricity to power 40,000 homes. Battery facilities that represented cutting-edge technology and astronomical cost, but were necessary for grid integration that would make renewable energy reliable rather than intermittent. Scarlett spent more time on construction sites than in boardrooms, hard hat and steel-toed boots replacing suits and heels, learning the technical details of transforming corporate strategy into physical infrastructure. The work was brutal. Summer in West Texas meant heat that made Houston feel temperate. Construction delays from supply chain problems and permitting issues. Union negotiations. Environmental reviews. 1,000 small disasters that threatened timelines and budgets, but slowly, methodically, the projects took shape. Wind turbines rising from prairie-like monuments to alternative futures. Solar arrays glinting in desert sun. Battery banks humming with stored energy that would flow to grids when demand peaked. 6 months into construction, Bloomberg ran feature story. Can Nash Energy complete energy's most ambitious pivot? The article was balanced, acknowledging progress while noting risks. Interviewed competitors who dismissed the strategy as expensive virtue signaling. Talked to analysts who questioned whether Scarlett had operational experience to execute at this scale. She read it once, filed it away, returned to actual work that mattered more than commentary. 9 months into the project, first wind farm went operational. 47 turbines generating enough electricity to power 12,000 homes, revenue stream that would reach positive cash flow within 3 years. Scarlett attended the ribbon-cutting small ceremony with local officials and workers who'd built the facility. No major media, no elaborate celebration, just acknowledgement that promises were becoming reality. Standing beneath those turbines, feeling the rhythmic whoosh of blades cutting air into electricity, she felt something that resembled peace. Not satisfaction, too much work remained for that luxury, but confirmation that the path she'd chosen was leading somewhere sustainable. Year 5 post-divorce arrived, with Scarlett turning 34, and Nash Energy transformed into something fundamentally different than the corrupt empire Dorian had built. Revenue hit $8 billion through combination of legacy operations, optimization, and renewable division that was ahead of schedule and under budget. Stock price reached $114, up from $78 when she'd secured board approval for renewable investment. Market capitalization approached $16 billion, making Nash Energy one of the most valuable independent energy companies in the United States. The financial press couldn't quite believe it. Young CEO with no operational experience had executed turnaround that veteran executives had thought impossible. Articles dissecting her strategy. Business schools teaching case studies about her transformation of corrupt company into industry leader. Scarlett declined most interview requests. Accepted one Forbes Women's Summit keynote where she'd been invited to speak about leadership and transformation. The summit happened in New York Conference Center in Midtown Manhattan, filled with 1,500 women who'd achieved success in fields that still resisted their participation. Entrepreneurs, executives, politicians, artists, scientists, collective net worth probably exceeding $100 billion. Scarlett's speech was scheduled for closing keynote prime slot that suggested the organizers believed her story had resonance beyond energy sector. She wore navy suit she'd bought specifically for the occasion. Nothing flashy, just professional uniform of someone who'd earned the right to be on that stage. Walked out to applause that felt generous, stood behind podium, looking at faces that ranged from early 20s to late 70s. Her prepared remarks lasted 20 minutes, covering the technical details of Nash Energy's transformation and the strategic decisions that had enabled it. But toward the end, she deviated from script into territory that felt more honest than any speech she'd written in advance. Someone once told me that I wasn't capable of building anything on my own, that my value came from proximity to powerful men rather than my own competence. Her voice carried across the room with clarity that sound system enhanced but didn't create. That person was my husband, the man I'd loved, the man whose career I'd supported for years before realizing support was being mistaken for subordination. The room quieted into a tension that transcended polite listening. He was wrong, not because I was exceptional, but because I refused to accept his assessment of my worth. I spent 4 years being dismissed and diminished. Then I spent 5 years proving that the only person whose opinion of me mattered was mine. She paused, looking at faces that showed recognition of experiences they'd lived in different contexts. I'm not telling you this as inspiration. I'm telling you this as warning. The world will underestimate you, will tell you that your achievements belong to men who mentored you or married you or simply stood near you while you did the work. Your choice is whether to internalize that assessment or reject it. I rejected it, built a company that's now worth $16 billion, employed 12,000 people, generated returns for investors who'd been told women couldn't lead at this scale. Her hands gripped the podium, physical anchor for emotional weight of what she was saying. The best revenge isn't destroying your enemy, it's outgrowing the need to think about them at all. Applause erupted, standing ovation from women who understood that success was victory and dignity was triumph. After the speech, she met with attendees in smaller reception. Entrepreneurs seeking advice, students asking about career paths, Executives comparing notes about navigating boardrooms that still defaulted to masculine assumptions about competence. One conversation stood out. Young woman, maybe 26, who approached with hesitation that suggested she wasn't sure her question deserved asking. I'm in relationship with someone who keeps taking credit for my ideas. My boyfriend. He works in the same company, different division. I come up with strategies, he presents them as his own. I've confronted him, but he says I'm being paranoid. Scarlett recognized the pattern, had lived that pattern, knew exactly where it led if intervention didn't happen. Leave. Not the company. Him. Because someone who steals your intellectual labor while gaslighting you about it won't suddenly develop integrity. He'll just get better at manipulation. The woman's expression showed conflict between hope that things would improve and understanding that they probably wouldn't. But I love him. I loved my husband too. Cost me 4 years before I learned that love without respect is just extended self-harm. Scarlett handed her business card gesture that felt small but might matter. If you need job, call me. Nash Energy is always hiring competent people, especially ones being undervalued elsewhere. Flying back to Austin the next morning, Scarlett processed the weight of having become person that younger women looked to for guidance. She'd never aspired to mentor role or symbolic significance, had just wanted to build something legitimate after escaping something corrupt. But apparently those goals were inseparable. Building legitimate enterprise required rejecting the corrupt patterns that normalized theft and credited men for women's labor. And rejecting those patterns at scale meant other women noticed and took permission to reject them themselves. The responsibility felt heavier than she'd expected, but not unwelcome. 2 weeks after the Forbes Summit, Scarlett received letter forwarded from Nash Energy's Houston headquarters. Handwritten envelope, return address in Santa Fe, New Mexico. No name, just address. She opened it at her Austin desk, afternoon light slanting through windows that overlooked cityscape she'd come to think of as home. The letter was single-page handwriting, elegant and precise. Scarlett, I saw your keynote speech online. Proud doesn't begin to cover what I felt watching you dismantle the pattern that nearly destroyed us both. You did what I couldn't, turn survival into transformation, rather than just escape. The enclosed photo is from my gallery opening last month. Thought you'd want to see that some of us are thriving in different ways. Congratulations on becoming who you were always meant to be. Natalia. The photo showed Natalia at gallery opening in Santa Fe, surrounded by art that looked contemporary and challenging, her smile genuine in a way it never had been during marriage to Dorian. She looked free, genuinely completely free from the weight of being diminished. Scarlett tucked the letter into her desk drawer where she kept things that mattered more than business documents. Reminder that different people had different definitions of success, and all of them were valid if they represented authentic choice rather than resigned acceptance. That evening, Griffin called with news that board was scheduling special meeting to discuss succession planning. They want to lock you in for another 5 years. Contract extension with compensation package that includes significant equity stake. Patricia Armstrong is leading the push. Patricia Armstrong, board member who'd opposed the renewable investment 18 months ago, now apparently convinced enough to advocate for long-term leadership commitment. What changed her mind? Results, stock performance, institutional investors who are demanding stability rather than turnover. Griffin's voice carried satisfaction that transcended business success. You've proven you can do this. Now they want to make sure you keep doing it. The special board meeting happened 2 weeks later. Same Dallas boardroom, same faces, different context now that Scarlett had demonstrated competence beyond reasonable doubt. Harold Westbrook presented terms that legal team had negotiated. 5-year contract extension. Base salary increased to $5 million. Performance bonuses tied to revenue growth and stock appreciation. Equity grant of 2 million shares, vesting over the term. 2 million shares at current stock price of $114 represented $228 million in paper wealth if she fulfilled the contract terms. The offer sat on the table between them, culmination of 5 years of work and evidence that she'd transformed from dismissed wife into essential executive. What do you think? Harold's question carried genuine interest rather than rhetorical performance. Scarlett considered the implications. 5 more years leading Nash Energy meant foregoing other opportunities, meant continued exposure to board scrutiny and shareholder pressure, meant responsibility for 12,000 employees and billions in invested capital. But it also meant finishing what she'd started, meant completing renewable transformation that would position the company for next 50 years, meant proving that women could lead at highest levels, not as exception, but as expectation. "I accept, on one condition," Harold's eyebrow raised, "which is, we establish scholarship fund for women in engineering and business, 50 million endowment, full ride for 100 students annually, named after my father whose brilliance was stolen and whose daughter learned that the only way to prevent theft is to claim ownership of your own value." The board exchanged looks. 50 million was material amount but affordable given company performance. Harold nodded. "Agreed. We'll announce the scholarship alongside your contract extension." They shook hands across mahogany that had witnessed countless deals. This one felt different. Not just transaction, transformation made permanent. The announcement happened the following Monday. Nash Energy CEO, Scarlett. Nash signs 5-year extension. Company establishes Nash Engineering and Business Scholarship for women pursuing STEM and business degrees. Media coverage was extensive, financial press focusing on contract terms, while education publications celebrated the scholarship. Scarlett spent announcement day in West Texas at wind farm that was celebrating first anniversary of operation, stood with workers who'd built the facility and maintained it, talking about expansion plans and technical innovations, rather than dwelling on personal achievement. Because at the end of the day, the work mattered more than the recognition. Building something sustainable mattered more than being celebrated for building it. That night alone in hotel room in Midland, Texas, Scarlett allowed herself a moment of reflection that she rarely indulged. 5 years ago, she'd been in federal prison visiting room watching her ex-husband realize he'd lost everything. Now she was CEO of $16 billion company with contract that guaranteed financial security and board support to complete transformation she'd started. The journey between those moments had been brutal, required learning skills she'd never wanted to acquire, becoming harder than she'd thought necessary, making decisions that cost people jobs and divested assets and prioritized future over present. But the alternative had been accepting diminishment, accepting that powerful men could steal from her without consequence, accepting that her value was determined by others rather than herself, and that alternative had been unacceptable. Her phone buzzed. Text from Ben. Year-end projections ready for review. Revenue tracking toward $8.4 billion. Renewable division will be cash flow positive by Q2 next year, 6 months ahead of schedule. She typed response, "Good. Schedule all-hands meeting for next week. Want to thank the team before holiday break." Because competence required recognition. Teams that felt valued performed better than teams that felt invisible. She'd learned that lesson from Dorian, learned it in reverse watching what happened when people weren't valued. Turned out most of her education had come from studying his failures rather than his successes. Learning what not to do was as valuable as learning what to do, especially when you were trying to build something legitimate from the ruins of something corrupt. Scarlett fell asleep in anonymous hotel room tomorrow, promising more construction sites and board meetings and decisions that would determine whether promises became reality or just expensive failures. But tonight she let herself feel something approximating satisfaction, not pride that felt presumptuous, just acknowledgement that she'd survived what should have broken her and built something that would outlast the man who'd tried to erase her. The woman who'd been dismissed as mistress, diminished as wife, and dismissed as threat had become the thing powerful men feared most: competent woman who'd learned their playbook and played it better than they could. And she was just getting started.